Well, I think Chairman Comer did a magnificent job exonerating Joe Biden of all the fraudulent charges that were raised against him in this Congress.
Nobody's buying what he's selling on that.
America's buying it. The reservoir of love for Joe Biden is deep and really bottomless.
In a move that was both hilarious and impressive, Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin humiliated MAGA Republican Congressman James Comer on the Fox Propaganda Network with Comer right beside him. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have a couple of clips to look at in this video, and this is going to be a fun video, okay? Because it highlights the rhetorical gifts of Jamie Raskin, a Democratic congressman who is one of my very favorites, perhaps my absolute favorite. He's the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, and he was interviewed on the Fox Propaganda Network by the Fox Propaganda Network alongside his counterpart, the chairman of the Oversight Committee, James Comer. So these two men side by side being interviewed by Comer's favorite network. And Raskin took the opportunity to stick it to Comer multiple times throughout the conversation. And I think it's pretty funny. So we're going to, before we play the clip, though, kind of give some background as to why the two were interviewed side by side. And what happened was both of them called for the resignation of the director of Secret Service. Okay, it was a rare bipartisan move in the aftermath of the failed assassination attempt on convicted felon Donald Trump. It was a grotesque failure of Secret Service security protocols, and there were bipartisan calls for the director of Secret Service to resign. So Politico goes into a bit of detail. Top oversight Dem joins GOP chair in calling for Secret Service director to resign. Quote, I will be joining the chairman in calling for the resignation of the director just because I think this relationship is irretrievable at this point. Jamie Raskin told Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle that he believes she should resign, capping off an hours-long hearing into security failures surrounding the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Quote, I don't want to add to the director's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, but I will be joining the chairman, again, that's James Comer, in calling for the resignation of Director Cheadle just because I think the relationship is irretrievable at this point. And it should be noted that subsequently Director Cheadle did indeed resign. So, in the aftermath of that rare spirit of bipartisanship, rare because MAGA Republicans in Congress don't want to cooperate with Democrats in any possible way as to be seen as giving President Biden and the Democrats a political victory, they still both appeared on the Fox Propaganda Network. And that was when this clip happened. And it's in reference to the failed impeachment effort led by James Comer against President Biden.
I'll just say, well, I think Chairman Comer did a magnificent job exonerating Joe Biden of all the fraudulent charges that were raised against him in this Congress. And of course, there was no high crime, no misdemeanor. And Joe Biden is a passionate public servant filled with integrity and honesty.
Nobody's buying what he's selling on
that. America's buying it. The reservoir of love for Joe Biden is deep and really bottomless in America.
You do disagree on a lot of things, as we can point out, but
I'll just say,
that was hilarious. I love it. Even Comer and Bret Baier are like the moxie on this guy. I mean, Bret Baier, who by the way, has just regressed into a total partisan hack. And hey, listen, as somebody who is proudly partisan, that's okay. Except Bret Baier presents himself as a nonpartisan journalist, whereas I'm a partisan political commentator. Even Baier, who has pro-Trump leanings, pro-Republican leanings, even he is smiling and laughing. And so is James Comer there. So again, pretty freaking funny and impressive of Jamie Raskin there. Now, a couple of things before we go on that score. I do want to remind people that the failed sham Biden impeachment inquiry is still technically ongoing. It's been the most consistent political initiative of the MAGA Republican Party ever since they took the majority in the House of Representatives. They have been incompetent and dysfunctional in so many other ways. They fail to pass their own legislative efforts on a partisan basis, right? They can't even get their own caucus together. They have their own caucus sabotaging one another. They, went through the speaker's debacle multiple times, 15 or so attempts to elect Kevin McCarthy as the Speaker of the House. And then they ousted him, 6 to 8 months later. Mike Johnson finally elevated to replace him after multiple failed attempts, including Jim Jordan. And it is the least productive iteration of Congress, perhaps in American history. And that's, again, exclusively the fault of MAGA Republicans in the House of Representatives, because again, they don't want to work with Democrats to pass common sense, widely popular provisions, including even just keeping the government funded, because they're worried it will be spun as a political victory for President Biden. So again, exclusively the fault of the Republican Party. The failed sham impeachment inquiry is no different, right? They have failed to produce evidence of a high crime and misdemeanor. We've covered this at length over the past several months. We haven't heard much of it lately because MAGA Republicans kind of put it on the back burner to focus on other things, but it's still technically ongoing, and it is a monument of failure. They've been called out by Fox News hosts, by Newsmax hosts, by OAN hosts, by former Republican congresspeople, by sitting Republican congresspeople, sitting Republican senators. That's how grotesque the failure of James Comer in this respect is. Another clip here, though, in which Bret Baier tries to spin the recent decision by President Biden to withdraw his nomination and in the endorsement of Vice President Harris. Bret Baier tries to spin this that Democrats staged a coup against President Biden and that this result is quite anti-democratic. But Jamie Raskin, of course, who is smarter than both of these men, has the answers and brings the receipts.
So now she is likely the nominee in Chicago. Do you think this process is okay with most Democrats, that there hasn't been voting for Vice President Harris?
Well, of course it is, because 14 million people voted for Joe Biden and for Kamala Harris for president and vice president. And obviously we expressed our full confidence in her when we elected her to be vice president originally. So we've been totally behind her, and our party is completely unified. The real question, of course, is over on the GOP side of the aisle, where the former vice president isn't even supporting Donald Trump anymore. Mike Pence said he's not supporting him. That was the breakneck speed, the speed with which Mike Pence got dropped. People were talking about hanging him, and then they stuck in J.D. Vance. Yeah. Instead, a guy who said that Donald Trump could be America's next Hitler. So that's the breakneck speed. That's the amazing turnaround.
You could only do common ground so long. And then.
And so, again, you can see it there. Raskin's having a good time here, sticking it to Comer, sticking it to Comer's party, and in a roundabout way, sticking it to Baier himself. I do want to emphasize, though, what he's saying here. A couple of things. I guess I'll address the Mike Pence thing. It is important to remember that convicted felon Donald Trump had to select a different running mate than his former vice president, because his former vice president doesn't want to work with him and won't endorse him, because that former vice president, Mike Pence, said that Donald Trump tried to authoritarianly make Pence put Trump above the Constitution when he demanded that Pence overturn a free and fair election for Donald Trump's favor. It's also important to remember that 40 out of 44 former cabinet members and senior staff members of the Trump administration will not endorse Donald Trump, and have explicitly, many of them, said that they will not endorse him because they think he's an idiot and an authoritarian and a threat to democracy. It's unprecedented. President Biden has never gone through that. President Obama, President Clinton, I mean, even other Republican presidents as well. That's how uniquely authoritarian and stupid and incompetent Donald Trump really is. But the other thing I want to emphasize is the first part of what Jamie Raskin had to say, which is this idea that the process was anti-democratic in terms of culminating in President Biden's withdrawal from the race and his endorsement of Vice President Harris. It's absurd. As the New York Magazine actually wrote earlier today, no, the Biden-Harris switch was not a coup. Republicans often claim that voters don't care about threats to democracy or their presidential nominee's history of lawlessness, given more pressing concerns like food and gasoline prices or crime or immigration. On the other hand, they put a lot of effort in counteracting pro-democracy Democratic messages. They claim it's actually the Biden administration that's endangered democracy by prosecuting Donald Trump and frantically registering, quote, illegal aliens, quote, to vote. This week, most pro-Trump outlets are hammering away at the claim that Biden's withdrawal from the general election contest and the impending substitution of Vice President Harris as the Democratic nominee is a coup and a deadly insult to democracy that has rejected the judgment of primary voters. Vox's Andrew Prokop collected some of the wilder assertions on these lines. And again, they go into detail. Tom Cotton, Marjorie Taylor Greene, et cetera, and so forth. And so the New York Magazine concludes, this line of argument is as feeble as it is loud and insistent. If Biden could be brushed aside against his will, why did it take so long, and why did the alleged orchestrators of the coup insist that Biden himself made the decision? Why did the ward bosses let Biden endorse a successor? Why is he avidly campaigning for Harris already? As for the allegedly offended primary voters, why do polls show that rank-and-file Democrats overwhelmingly approve of Biden's decision and are overwhelmingly happy with Harris as the nominee? Even more obviously, the imputation of lawlessness to Democrats is simply ignorant. Biden's delegates were never legally bound to him, and a presumptive nominee has no right to a place on a general election ballot until a formal nomination has occurred. It's true. President Biden was not the nominee. The Democratic National Convention in which a nominee would be formalized and formally selected hasn't occurred yet. President Biden has every legal and ethical right to withdraw from the race. And again, Democratic politicians, Democratic voters, Democratic delegates, donors, everybody had every right to voice their frustration publicly or privately with the president and try to influence his decision. None of that is anti-democratic. None of it's illegal. None of it's unethical. And so what it comes down to, again, at the end of the day, is Republicans and their media apparatus, including the Fox propaganda network, engaging in bad faith and false equivalence to try to undermine the credible, irrefutable arguments that Donald Trump is a unique threat to democracy. They're hoping, they know they can't redeem him in the eyes of voters, but they're hoping to blemish the Democrats in turn so that voters will see these two candidates or these two parties as comparable when in fact they are not. Anyway, great performance by Jamie Raskin. I love the fact that he humiliated James Comer to his face on the Fox propaganda network in front of viewers who might not otherwise get the opportunity to see Comer humiliated. And he did it so well that both Comer and the Fox host in question, Bret Baier, clearly found it amusing. Let me know what you think in the comments.